What's the one thing that terrifies veteran paranormalist Kathy Kelly? And what on earth does this have to do with Abraham Lincoln, Sharon Tate's murder, the Big Bang Theory, Edgar Allan Poe, and the Marvel Universe? On this episode of Curious Explorers, we talk about everything from precognition and precognitive dreams that foretell doom. Can you use this information to change your future? And what on earth does this have to do with Burt Goldman, who made quantum jumping famous? In other words, picking a parallel universe future you and using that to change the course of your life. Stay tuned for this and more in this episode of Curious Explorers. So hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Curious Explorers. I'm Tracy Stein here with my good friend and veteran paranormalist, Kathy Kelly. Hi, Kathy.
Hey, Trace, what's up?
Well, I am excited to hear all about your travels. You've been on the road quite a bit, checking out a whole bunch of stuff. I'm laughing because I'm glad I'm not checking it out with you because, you know, it's particularly unnerving and spooky, but I want to hear all about your journey.
Yeah, well, I hopefully will be bringing a lot of this content to everybody. As you know, I started about a week ago. I've been throughout the Northeast at this point. I'm now in West Virginia. That building behind me is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, and I'll be investigating that tonight. Hopefully, at some point, I'll be bringing some exciting footage for all of you guys. But that's why we're doing this way versus us being in the same room, because we're both curious and we explore different things, right? So this time I'm exploring in a lunatic asylum, and
As one does.
as one is wont to do.
As you do.
Right, absolutely, as I love to do. So I was thinking we had been talking last week about a very, very specific event, very, very specific subject matter. And it got me thinking about what parts of the paranormal are not haunted related, or not necessarily spirits or ghouls or jump scares or things that are that can still be very unnerving, but don't necessarily fall into kind of one of the more accepted definitions of paranormal. And you and I were talking about things that scare us. And it occurred to me that one of the things that I find very unnerving are stories of precognition and
Yes.
stories of premonitory dreams. Now, in the museum, we have a couple of artifacts that are associated with those things because there are large historical moments that have been published. And you and I were talking about that. And it kind of just got me on this idea of like, well, what else is there that's out there? And so I thought I would bring to you a little research that I did about precognition. And I thought it would be broader than it was, but when I started doing my research, I kind of really distilled down to a more narrow path, which I thought would be more easy to, well, I thought it was fascinating, but I also thought it might be more easy to discuss. So I'm going to read this to you. You feel free to interject as you are wont to. And these are just some of my ideas, but they're supposed to spark conversation.
Great.
Paranormal is a blanket term that covers so many subjects, and we always get caught up in the spooky and the atmospheric. But some of the broader subjects, some of the subjects that don't fall comfortably underneath that umbrella are just as fascinating, and some of them to me are scarier. One of the subjects that's always enthralled me, and you and I talked about it, was the idea of premonitory dreams or precognition. In other words, knowing something before it happens, and then having some kind of phenomena occur that shows that your dream was true or your thought was true. It's not always dreams. Sometimes it's just a feeling. And of course, what scares me about that, and it scares me on like a molecular level, is that it seems to imply that if we can pre-know events, then at least part of our experience, our human experience, is predetermined. It's already written. And I find that terrifying. In other words, our chapters are already written, and that, as queen bee, independent woman, I don't like that. I don't like the idea that I'm on a road because somebody else put me there. It's more complicated than that, of course, because the tentacles of precognition can also lead one down different rabbit holes like time travel, collective thinking, alternate timelines, and different planes of existence. I was thinking about this the other day because this actually happened during a conversation I was having with a friend of mine where she had this intense, and I think this happened with you too. She had this intense sense of deja vu. And
Definitely.
we all have moments of deja vu where we stand up and we think, oh, I feel like I've done this before. A lot of times it's happening during something mundane. So you probably have done it before, but there's something about it that's not about the repetition of it, but that's about the totality of the experience. And it can be very unnerving because you can't quite put your finger on why. And it feels unfamiliar. So even though the moment feels familiar, the feeling doesn't feel familiar. And so sometimes those experiences are so strong that we stop what we're doing and we reference it. I've been here before. This has happened before. And a lot of times we think, I must have dreamt this, which is to where it's like almost accepted to us that we do dream these things. And so, in fact, we do know that famous people who have been victims or who have died, um, have in fact recorded having had these moments prior to these things actually happening in true life. So, and the reason why I'm referencing famous people is because reporters don't generally interview regular people when they're having moments of deja vu. Um, and these cases are particularly interesting to us as investigators and as people because they're evidentiary, because the stuff is recorded before it's happened. So it's not necessarily someone saying, I had this experience of deja vu and then it happened. It's someone saying, I had this weird dream, right? Or I had this weird vision. And then that's recorded and written, and then the vision or the dream comes true. So I'm going to give you a couple of cases of those.
Okay.
One of the most famous, of course, is Abraham Lincoln.
Knew you were going
And
to
I'm
say that.
huge Lincoln file, right? Love Abraham Lincoln. But he reportedly spoke of a dream where he saw himself laid out on a funeral shroud in the East Room of the White House, which was not traditionally where funerals were held. He actually was wandering through the White House, heard screaming and crying and keening, walked into the East Room and turned to a young man who was a Union soldier who was standing guard there, and said, "Who is mourning? Who is grieving in the White House?" And in his dream, the young soldier said, "The president has been shot. He was felled by an assassin's bullet." But here's the thing: he was Abraham Lincoln. He was hated by 50% of the population. He had a stack of letters in his desk that was essentially people promising his death, swearing they were going to assassinate him. So he knew that this was a possibility, if not an inevitability, right? So it's probably not out of the realm of possibility that he would have dreamt that. But then there's another story that, as I was researching, I came up with, and this is about someone that you and I have actually talked about, and this is about Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was one of the murder victims of the Manson family, and she starred in a series of films just prior to her death. She was really becoming kind of famous, and she had an interview with the magazine Marie Claire. In that interview, which was about a year before she died, or within the year before she died, she claims to have seen someone tied up on the staircase of the house that she and her husband were renting, and that she saw Jay Sebring in the dream with her. Jay Sebring actually did end up dying with her. He was also murdered by the Manson family. In the nightmare where she saw this person tied on the stairs, she could not tell if that person was male or female,
Mm.
but that person had been killed by having their throat cut. And
Yeah.
now Jay Sebring, of course, died defending Sharon Tate, and he was stabbed to death by the lunatic soldiers of Charles Manson. So here's the thing with things like that. Like what's really impressive about that is that she was like, I had this crazy dream. And it was reported, and the reporter has the notes of this occurring 3 or 4 months prior to essentially this playing out. But those two experiences that I'm talking about are very personal, right? So they're very much about themselves, and they're crisis driven, right? So it's about your death. Now, the Lincoln thing, you could say, well, he had this thing, he was president, It wasn't unlikely that he would be assassinated. Sharon Tate, though, really had no reason to think that there would be some kind of violent crime in the house that she was renting, because ultimately she was killed because of a mistake that was made by the killers. They went to the wrong house. So she wasn't the target. There was no reason for her to think, wow, gee, I wonder if she was living in a safe place. There'd never been, horrific throat slicing murders there in the past.
She
So,
wasn't famous enough for somebody to be really
and
focused on her.
and it wasn't a common thing. It
No.
wasn't, it wasn't a common thing that happened. And the fact that Jay Sebring was there, yeah, he was a very good friend of hers, but he didn't live with her, you know. So in doing some additional research, but those are very personal, right? Those are,
Right.
maybe they speak to our personal fears or whatever. So then I kind of dug a little bit deeper. And some cases of precognition, though, they defy any simple explanation. So for me, when COVID-19 first became the epidemic that it became, right, in the early weeks, the first thing that I thought of was Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, right? Because we were splitting into the haves and the have-nots, where there were people who kind of were like, well, I'm just gonna, go live in isolation, but I'm wealthy and I can do all these things. And then you had people who just weren't going to be able to be as protected as others. And there was this weird way that we were splitting. But in Poe's Masque of the Red Death, a plague emerges and the haves hide themselves in a walled city, but death comes for them relentlessly. The plague of the Red Death was the most fearsome ever seen in Poe's work, and Prince Prospero, who was the person in charge in his work, decides to take the most influential, beautiful, and wealthy people of his court into seclusion, where they live luxuriously while his subjects die in abject pain by the thousands.
Mhm.
Quote, the external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. End quote. And after 6 months, the world outside, unknown to them because they're in isolation, the prince decides to throw a mask, a big party, right? And at the height, which is of course disgusting, at the height of hubris, and really shows his disdain for the seriousness of the plague. And of course, death attends, right? Death manages to get in. Maybe it gets in a cask of wine, or maybe it gets in some way. But I thought that Poe's work was strangely accurate to what happened to us, right? It happened to the world. But it was neither the first nor the best example of Edgar Allan Poe predicting the future. There is being ahead of your time, and then there is literally defining the phrase being ahead of your time. In his work, Eureka, published a year before his death, so in 1848, and ultimately banned in Russia, where he was hugely popular for its novel and absolutely revolutionary idea, this long and complex poem speaks of a universe ever expanding and having been created in one instantaneous flash, derived from a single primordial particle. This is 1848. This is 1848. It's something conceptually inconceivable, even by the greatest scientific and astronomical minds of its time. It's not something that even begins to enter the realm of theory until the 1920s. Now, had people heeded him, there would have been a long-running television show called One Instantaneous Flash, which would have introduced the public to the private lives of hardcore comic nerds who unravel the mysteries of the universe. But we had to wait for the Big Bang Theory, and that's why we have a TV show called The Big Bang Theory. So one could hardly be blamed for wondering if Poe was a man from another time, but his ponderings were not always so lofty or universal. It wasn't always conceptual. He also seems to have predicted the fate of a single person in minute detail. The narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket is Poe's full-length novel. He wasn't very successful in his life as a short story or a long short story writer. He did have some popularity with his poetry. It didn't pay a lot. He actually made most of his money as a critic. He was a very good critic, which of course also led to him having lots and lots of enemies. Poe was cursed, certainly in his own mind. with a lack of success with his short story work. And he wrote this in 1838 as a way to try to see if he could generate some money. And it's a novel of adventure, but because it's Edgar Allan Poe, it's also very macabre. It was, and it's almost like a horror. There's a horror element to it, and it was the horror element that likely condemned the work. It was considered to be too macabre for adventure people and a little bit too dark for the public. It was not a financial success, but for our purpose, it was uniquely interesting. It's the tale of a young man, Arthur Gordon Pym, who crosses the globe with spectacular good and bad luck. Along the way, he meets with all manner of adventure, including a shipwreck that left him one of four survivors, including a cabin boy named Richard Parker. And while the survivors drifted aimlessly on the unforgiving ocean and time passed, the survivors realized that starvation was imminent, and it was decided that they would draw straws, and whoever drew the short straw would be killed and eaten.
Oof.
Unfortunately for poor Richard Parker, the youngest of the group, he was the tenderest and he drew the short straw. Now, this seems fairly typical of Poe, right? It's a kind of gross thing. It's dark, it's macabre. And the novel was that way. It was dark and it was long, and it's not among his most commonly read works. But this becomes more interesting when one learns of a yacht called the Minion. And this is actually, in reality, this is a historical yacht. There were four sailors. Three of them were very experienced, and one was a young cabin boy. They left England in May of 1884, so roughly 36 years after Poe had written and published his work, to deliver a yacht to its new owner in Australia. Now, the yacht was an inland vessel. It was not designed for transatlantic crossings, but these were very experienced sailors, and this was how they planned on getting it there. So the captain was very, very experienced. They thought they would be able to deliver this boat with no issues, and they were fine for about 2 months. Unfortunately, in July, as they came around the Cape of Good Hope, their luck ran out. An unexpected gale took the yacht and completely destroyed it. The four men survived in a small, poorly constructed lifeboat, and they too drifted aimlessly. They drifted for 3 weeks with no real provisions. Now, one of the four survivors was a young cabin boy named Richard Parker. He literally had the same name as the person in Poe's work. He became delirious with thirst and he drank seawater, which made him even sicker. And two of the remaining three survivors thought, well, he's done for. And so they decided to kill him and eat him. And they did.
Oh,
They did. They killed him and eat him. They ultimately were rescued. So
oh my God.
ultimately they survived. He obviously did not, but ultimately they survived. They were arrested and tried, and ultimately they were convicted for manslaughter. However, because of the circumstances, which was essentially if they hadn't consumed him, they would have died, but they killed him in order to do it. So it wasn't that he died and then they cannibalized him; they killed him. They served only 6 months, and they were a little bit upset at having done that, having gotten that, because they really felt that it was self defense, from
Ugh.
that they had to. However, right, all of that aside, this was a very well publicized event. It was news around the world. It changed maritime law, but it occurred literally 30 years after Edgar Allan Poe died. 36 years before, after he published it, and 30 years after he himself was in the ground. So it's not like he could have read this newspaper or, maybe heard about it, in transition. So did Poe once again reach into the future and pull off the details of a single case? It was really well publicized at the time. However, it was almost 40 years after his story. Is it just coincidence? Is it the million monkeys with a million typewriters in a room producing Hamlet theory, right? Which is essentially saying eventually, these things kind of happen. But this seems to me to be strangely beyond chance. I think this is one of those events that happen that I'm not that kind of defy a simple and common explanation. What do you think?
So I have all kinds of thoughts, as you might imagine. I'm going to start with what I think somebody who would be misusing the term skeptic and adopting it as their badge, might say, because you and I both know that skeptic just means that you want to see what the evidence is, right? But not that no matter what it is, you won't believe it. So I could imagine and to me, this is so far-fetched because the likelihood that these sailors had read that semi-obscure work by Edgar Allan Poe and then gotten on a boat and unconsciously, because this guy's name was Richard Parker, they're like, oh, we should probably eat him. It's been done before.
But there would also have had to have been a shipwreck. There would have also, you know what I mean? So even those things would, to me.
So I don't think that, by the way, I don't think that's it. I think time is funny, and I think sometimes there are little breakthroughs, and I don't think time is completely linear. And I think that however that happens, I don't know, but I think psychically we tune into things that are relevant to us and things that are not relevant to us.
So we had a bunch of cases there, though, right? So Poe essentially,
that's my take on the Poe case,
right? Like, but Poe also essentially described the Big Bang Theory.
That
60 years, more than that,
crazy.
70 years before. And in this work, he talks about black holes. He talks, not only is the Big Bang Theory like the idea that it's one kind of primordial particle in an instant, but he talks about an ever increasing universe, which was not on the radar at the time. And it makes me think of like Van Gogh, how Van Gogh would paint certain imagery, and then later on, people were like, well, maybe he actually saw those things, So you have Poe, who was not a scientist. Right. He wasn't an astronomer, stepping into something that was so revolutionary that Russia was like, nope, we're not going to talk about that. You know what I mean? Like, we're not going to get into that. And then on top of that, he has multiple that to me is one of those things where maybe you could imagine something, but the discussion is really specific. Like one particle, like one, he essentially says Big Bang,
So I had the same kind of feeling, and I know there are people who, no matter what, won't buy this, but like when you think about Nostradamus and the things that this series, it's not even just one thing, but the things that he predicted closer to his lifetime and in his lifetime, and the stuff that he predicted hundreds of years beforehand. Like, I think, first of all, I think everybody's psychic to some extent, but everybody's not, everybody can play piano. Not everybody's going to be Chopin or Mozart. Right. I think that there are some people who are wildly tapped in, including to stuff that has some, I think it's also easier to tap into things that have significant emotional
So my question would be, but what are they tapping into? Like, is this with the Big Bang, he's looking at this and saying, no, this makes sense to me for the universe, right? Okay. But like, is he tapping into time? Is he stepping forward to a time when people knew that? Is he innately understanding something about the universe that is it the Akashic record? Is it,
could be,
is it, but I mean, I think for me, that's where I get caught up, where it's like, obviously these things happen. Obviously there's stuff that is not easily explainable, right?
I'm going to tell you just from remote viewing is, as far as I know, the most systematic psychic discipline. It is very structured. It has been tested. It was funded, as you know, by our government for 20 years. So I feel comfortable saying
it's testable, right?
Yes. One of the things people talk about in the remote viewing community is that events that have a significant impact, especially a significant emotional impact or something that is very significant energetic impact, are easier to tune into than things that are kind of, no one would really care about it. So things that are personal, things that would cause an extreme emotional reaction, or things that have like a larger scale significance. And in fact, actually, as an example, if you're going to view, I'm just going to use this as an example, Chernobyl, right? A month before that incredible nuclear disaster, and that's your target, right? Because the target can be that specific. I'm going to tell you right now, almost everybody is going to be drawn not to what happens on that day a month before, but the explosion of that nuclear reactor,
Mhm.
because that's what draws people. So I think that it would be extremely interesting to think that Edgar Allan Poe was wired to tap into something that's incredibly important, like this discovery, right? Big
Mhm.
Bang Theory. But it could be not that it's just the facts of it, but that he's tuning into the impact, and the impact, like, on so many levels, right? Emotional, scientific, social. I think those things, some people, it's like, it just, there's something their consciousness just taps into.
Great Britain has something called the Precognition Bureau, and they created that after a massive event that happens in Wales. And it was the Almford School. A school was destroyed when a slag heap from the local coal mine fell on it, right? And 160 people were killed, 140, 138 of them were children under the age of 12. And these kids had had dreams and had essentially said, I'm not afraid to die, or I had an image that this was happening. The thing is, of course, that there had been this giant black slag heap above them their entire lives. So the idea that this mountain of coal refuse might fall probably was something they were somewhat concerned with on a subconscious level. I
But
guess
maybe
for
they weren't,
me,
because it had never happened. You know what I mean? It
but
becomes
what
like part of the scenery that
I'm
you don't even
I'm
notice.
just, but I think
No, I
that
hear you.
when you hear about those, you kind of are like, I get it. I think there are environmental explanations for why they felt that warning, right? Why they felt that, why they kind of were like open to it.
But why
Um,
then?
I think it's natural. I don't think it's, so I think that these are all environmental cues that we pick up on different parts of our brains and different parts of our consciousness. But when you're talking about stuff that happens so far ahead and so unrelated, the Richard
Yeah,
Parker thing gets me. It just gets me
yeah,
because it's
yeah.
it's almost as if it's happening to show that it's happening. Here you have an incredibly well-known writer, right? Who is not well known in his life. He's not successful in his life. He's not well known. The book's not read in his life. No one really pays any attention to it until this other event happens. It's almost like write this so that 40 years from now, people will look at this and say, wow, there's something else to this. You know what I mean? I'm not arguing one way or the other with it because I have no idea how to explain it. I accept it as paranormal in nature.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
just,
not a hard sell for me.
yeah, it's not, not at all.
It's not
To
at all.
me, it's what is it? Is it time travel? Is it the string theory? Is it the multiverse? Is it the idea that time doesn't move linearly because we know that it doesn't? We know that it curves. We know that it turns. We know, all of these things we know now. We know that they're empirically proven, and we also know that time is not. It's not as strict as Back to the Future would have us believe. They may not be predestined or predetermined in the totality of time, but they might be in your individual time.
And I actually would love for us to kind of talk a little bit about that, because what you said in the beginning of our conversation was, and you referred to yourself as a queen bee, which you are. When you said what worries you about the idea of precognitively tapping into something, divining the future, having a moment where the future is very clear in the now.
Right.
Does that mean you don't have free will? And that has come up again and again and again. Remote viewing is not the only discipline, but it's one where, because it's so systematic, I feel like it lends a little more credibility to what I'm going to say. Because I've had this conversation with mediums that I know, and,
Hmm.
I've done psychic work myself. And sometimes something can be so clear that this is something you are discerning about a future event.
Hmm.
I think, what I've heard people talk about is certain events are more probable,
Right.
but, as you get closer to them, maybe they are even more probable. And certain things are possible, and maybe you're going to do something that's going to pull it closer or not. But the reverse is true too, right? If I know that I have a bad feeling about getting on a plane, and in the dream I get on that plane
Yeah.
and I die, and I change my trip, I
Right.
don't die on that plane.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And that's like
I
an
do.
awful
I do.
example, but it's even something like, there are a million things that we change course on because of a feeling we get that attracts us to something or away from something. We
Right.
make it more
Right.
probable or less probable.
And that's interesting too, because it's like we're in this kind of stew, or something that's conductive. We're in this kind of primordial stuff of, or psychically primordial stuff that we're picking up on, but encouraged we're encouraged to do that, in certain circumstances, and to lean into the hunch in certain circumstances. As a woman, it's always like, trust your gut, trust your instinct. And then there are certain cases where it's like, no, no, get on the plane. What are you talking about? You're crazy.
Don't be
You know what I
ridiculous.
mean? you know, but that's true. I found it as I was doing more research into it and some of the more famous cases. There's a lot out there. And the issue with Nostradamus is that we see his stuff in hindsight. We don't see it necessarily as it's coming up, right? Unfortunately nobody stopped history. They didn't say, well, that sounds an awful lot like it. So that's kind of the problem with, it's like the Nostradamus effect is almost like the Cassandra effect, right? Where it's
Yes.
like he's out there saying it, but nobody's really listening. But in these cases, these few small cases, even the Sharon Tate, like, that's almost impossible to just throw away. The odds of her meeting the end that she met at the time was extremely rare. I mean, like it was almost out of the realm of
Horrendous.
possibility. And it's all of the things that had to happen in order for that to happen. They were not told to go to that building. They were looking for someone else. She just had Jay Sebring, that she happened to have those people at the house. Roman Polanski happened to be out of town. All of those things. But then when you learn that she had this dream, a dream that was strong enough that she was like, I'm going to tell this to this national magazine.
That's, believe it or not, the thing that really gets me,
Me
because I
too.
don't know enough about her to know if she was regularly telling people about her dreams. It's unlikely that sitting with a reporter when you're an up and coming actress, but you're not
Mhm.
there,
Right.
especially then, that the
Right.
thing you are going to tell a reporter is anything negative or frightening. And I'm assuming the reporter was a stranger on top of it.
Right. I think it was one of those things where it was like it casually came up in conversation
I don't
prior
know how
to
that
the
casually
interview.
comes up,
Well,
honestly.
maybe they were talking about psychic phenomena. Maybe they're oh, you live there. Oh, this. And I don't think it was a part of the converse. I don't think it was part of the interview, but it was recorded, right? So it's kind of like
That's
there's a
crazy to
story.
me.
That me too. Like, so there's a story about Abraham Lincoln where, and I mean, Abraham Lincoln just has, so many unusual things that have happened around him, where you do feel sometimes that you are at the crossroads of fate and destiny and
Yeah,
history and all of those things where
completely believe you.
where he was
Completely
not going to get
agree.
out. He was not going to get out of this. But he used to have all of these prophetic dreams where he was well known for going down to the telegraph office when there was going to be a battle and waiting to hear what the results were. And he used to have these dreams, and he would be on this boat. And if he was facing a certain direction, he thought it meant victory. If he was facing another direction, he thought it was defeat. And he would go down and telegraph his generals and be like, "Hey, I think we need to make these." He was very hands-on. I think we need to make these changes and whatnot. But the dream that I was telling you about, he actually told it at a dinner party. So the White House was a lot more accessible to people, and it was a big deal to be invited to the White House still, right? So I think it was maybe 3 months before it happened, or 2 months before he was assassinated, and he isn't acting himself, and the people who are in attendance are like, "Hey, what's going on? You seem a little bit off." He's, "Oh, but they wrote about it in their diaries. That's how we know, right?" So they didn't write about it in their diaries afterwards. They wrote about it in their diaries that night. They went home and said, "I had dinner at the White House. The president was in rare form, but then he told us this dream."
And what
And
are the odds of somebody then, the president of the United States at that time, telling
telling,
people about something so personal and disturbing at these
You know, I
things
mean,
that probably
I
always
mean,
have some level of formality.
he was a person who was likely to do that. He was unlikely to write anything down. He didn't keep a journal. He didn't keep a diary. He's unlikely to write that down. And he was a storyteller. You know, he was a person that was going to share these things. But
That's an
enough that
odd
he
thing to
said
share.
no. But enough. Well, he also
I wouldn't
he
tell
he
people that dream.
believed. Oh,
Most
right,
most people. I tell
but
you.
right, but he did right, and these people weren't like the people that he had were personal friends, right? So these were people who they weren't dignitaries. However, it's still odd, you know. I mean, it's still very very strange, and it had annoyed him enough. He'd had it more than once, and that's why he called it strangely annoying. And you know, I mean, he also was supposedly having participating in seances at the White House. There's no real evidence of that. I would not put it past him. Knowing
Just talk about the dream.
Lincoln, yeah, and knowing him through that, I would not put it, and I wouldn't put it past him that he had seances. I wouldn't. I think he was a person that was strangely in tune with fate and unusually in tune with fate. In fact, it's very strange because, and I'm going to go a little off subject, but
But at least you're
on
telling
this
me, so I can
on
prep
this
myself for
on this
whatever's
trip
coming
on this trip
that you're on
that
now
I'm on here, I stayed at
to
the well, now I'm at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but the
in
earlier part of the week I spent in Weston, West Virginia. But in the earlier part of the week, I spent an evening at the Omni Hotel in Boston, and of course, John Wilkes Booth spent an evening at the Omni Hotel in Boston, 8 days prior to killing Abraham Lincoln, and actually went to a shooting range while he was up there. I am often surprised by how Abraham Lincoln shows up in my life. You know how these little threads go through, but I will also say I seek them out. But I thought, you know, I do think it's interesting. You know, we talk about these famous moments because, like I said, people record the events of famous people, but these happen commonly in all of our lives. You know, we all have had those moments where without going to a psychic, without going to a medium, where something has happened where you just say that I can't explain that,
it's
you know.
uncanny.
And it is funny because Carl Jung had two prophetic dreams that actually led to him splitting with Freud. He believed he was shown world wars in those dreams. He believed that he had these dreams, which again, you could say, well, you know, the politics of the time, but, you know, he saw pestilence and he saw things that had not yet, like he saw mustard gas, which had not yet been, you know, used in warfare. But these things, whether or not you believe in them, have had an impact on, you know, there was another one where Oppenheimer couldn't get past a certain mathematical equation that he couldn't get past and fell asleep, had a dream, and it came to him in a dream. So you can say, well, that's the brain working, or maybe it's a little nudge, you know, like maybe it's something else working a little bit. Like I said, I find it unnerving. I'm not afraid of ghosts. I'm not afraid of demons or anything like that. A little afraid of demons. But this I do find unnerving. I do find it
Yeah.
unnerving.
No, you know what's so funny is that I don't find it as unnerving. I mean, and you and I've had these conversations. We've both had all kinds of, psychic experiences. I actually think having precognitive dreams are actually, I think it's actually fairly common. I think the people who say, well, I don't remember my dreams are actually still tapping into something. They just don't consciously remember them.
Right.
Maybe when they do connect to those things, they're having that deja vu moment where they can't quite put their finger on why it's so familiar.
Right.
But
Right.
psychic experiences in general are fairly common. And I think a lot of times people just don't like to talk about them in that language. So they come, like you were talking about, gut feelings or hunches. And there are people who say they had a hunch and who have them all the time, but won't say they had, they won't call it psychic. I'm just going on a little bit of a tangent, if I may, because, I've recommended to people, oh, you've got this going on. You've tried every mundane means to get clarity on this. Well, what about consulting with somebody who's very psychic and
Right.
doesn't have a personal investment, so that it's not clouded, whatever comes through.
Right.
And people are like, oh, no, that's not for me. Some people because they say, well, it's not possible. And other people because they say, God, I don't want to know. I don't want to know whatever they tell me. And I kind of feel like if you get the information,
Right.
there's some utility for you, whether it's preparing yourself or making a change.
No,
So I
yeah,
find those
absolutely.
things like, yay, not scary.
To me, what's scary is it honestly, it's just that one concept of we're just pieces on a board. I mean, you and I have talked about this as well. I personally don't believe, generally speaking, that when you go to a psychic, I think that person is using whatever ability they have, which might be more heightened than yours or less heightened or equal. But I don't generally think that you get information that you consciously seek out that you can't change. I've talked to lots of psychics in my career, lots of people who are professional psychics, and they'll say, if I'm telling you this, it's because there
There's a
is a way to
reason.
change it. And there is a way that it doesn't have to be the way that it is. It's very much, like a Christmas Carol, where it's like, I'm telling you this because you still have you can't change the past, but the past can change you. And therefore, the past can change your future. But, to me, this was one of those interesting subjects where once I started digging into it, I was like, oh no, I'm going down this rabbit hole. And I decided to stick with the more famous stuff because, nobody wants to hear what Lenny Lincoln had to say. They want to, I mean, you and I do. I find it fascinating. And there's
Lenny.
the Ryan Institute published a great book on it, which I'll try to pull together. I think it was Dr. Sally Feather wrote a book about precognition.
Yes.
And it's a great book. And it's literally just people telling their stories without, they're not getting anything from it. They're just saying, this happened in my life. I find that very compelling. I lean in on believing people because I think it's very easy to throw stuff away. But this is, this is the minutia of people's lives. And I think that they generally are honest when they're sharing it.
I have another somewhat tangential thought, and we can talk about it in this episode. We could talk about it in another episode. I'm okay either way. But also to your earlier point about to what extent are things changeable or not, precognitive things are foretelling something that's changeable. We have free will, we don't. Have you heard of Burt Goldman?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I hadn't heard of him until a few years ago, and actually his work was very interesting. The Cliff Notes version is he is a guy who very much believed in parallel universes, but that
Hmm.
in this current life that you're in, you could tap into one of your other parallel lives and learn a skill more easily
Well,
that you don't have now, change the trajectory of this life by tapping
so
into an alternate experience.
So 2 points. One, make sure that you reference what Cliff Notes are because lots of people listening to them will have no idea.
Ah, the
And,
short,
and
concise
two,
version,
two,
the bullet-pointed version.
Marvel Universe, they've stepped into a lot of the multiverse in their storytelling, which means that Stan Lee was doing this and was encouraging graphic artists and graphic novelists to do this in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, where lots of people that were going into scientific theories that were not mainstream at all at the time. But most recently, there was a Scarlet Witch and Doctor Strange too. Literally, that happens in it, where spoiler alert, where they're attempting to defeat what we would call a big monster. And in order to be able to do that, they have to step into alternate universes, which are not the same as modern as their own universe, but allows them to learn new things and allows them the opportunity to explore other things and to become more skillful to then step back into their timeline. And I was watching a TV show the other night where it takes place in 1987, and there's an attorney, and he's sitting down to do something, and he's at a typewriter, and how technology from 1987, which was high school for me, to now has grown to where we no longer fear technology. We lean into technology so much, where in the early 90s, if you talked about life on other planets or something like that, you were seen as a lunatic. Whereas now if you make the claim that there isn't life on other planets, people are like, you're nuts, because our concept of the universe has become so expanded and so, so fluid and so broad that pop culture is incorporating those ideas in a way that for the average viewer now, it just makes sense. It's just like that's theory, but it makes sense. And I
And
think that that's remarkable.
yeah, absolutely. It's always so interesting to me when things come into the entertainment realm that some people say, "Oh, well, that's just the Marvel universe," and somebody else will say, "Well, no, that maybe they're talking about this and they've just made it into this intriguing series." I mean, Burt Goldman had worked with Jose Silva and collaborated
Right.
with him. For anybody who's new to that name, Silva Mind Control. Now, Mind Valley is kind of re-upping the Silva Mind Control teaching, but basically it is tapping into something different that you want to make happen for you in your life, even before people were talking and using the term manifesting. So Burt Goldman was using the term quantum jumping.
Hmm.
But again, I think he was talking about things like that before the term quantum was really in the common
Right.
vernacular. He had all of these examples in his own life of applying these things. And, even in his 80s, becoming a successful photographer, becoming a successful singer, all these things that he
Hmm.
had not done previously because, according to him, he had journeyed to these parallel lives. And
I'm going to look into
so
that.
what's interesting is there are probably an infinite number of other things that if we believe that that's true, that you can also change
Hmm.
for the better, right?
And
Like
that does
what
kind of
path you want to take.
that does lead us back to what we talked about, like to the kind of much more casual subject of precognition, because that makes sense. That you could step into a timeline. I say it makes sense. It makes sense. It makes sense academically. I think that people might still have a difficult time with it in their reality, which doesn't mean that it won't. We have lots of problems, accepting things in our reality that are true. Right here, guilty.
All of us, everybody. But if precognitively, you tap into something, you're like, I don't like the feeling of what came in my dream or in my meditation or whatever, or the vibe I
Hmm.
got. So what do I want to be different? Because really, this is super interesting to both of us and to a lot of
Right.
people in and of
Hmm.
itself, even if there was no utility to it. But there might very well be quite a significant utility to tapping into this.
I feel like
Probable
there
now.
always was, though. Like I do feel like there was a utility to all of those things. Maybe if only for Richard
Yeah.
Parker to not become a sailor. But I don't know if you watched the most recent American, well, not it's not American Horror Story, but it's another series Mike Flanagan does, and Mike Flanagan is a really great director, but he also has the most remarkable way of talking about death and consciousness, and
Interesting.
allows his performers to go into these massive monologues that are just beautiful and poignant and smart, and he does it in all of his series, and I mean they're really remarkable. He recently did a series of, I think, 8 episodes that there was an overarching story, but it was based on the works of Edgar Allan Poe. So each episode was a work of Edgar Allan Poe, and it was great. It was fun. It was a lot of things. But Arthur Pym is a character in it, and he's a lawyer, and but at one point, one of his great throwaway lines is he's walking out and he turns around to his assistant and he goes, "Do me a favor, call Richard Parker. I'm having him for dinner and I'm going to be late." And it was just one
Oh,
of those things that was so perfect and so clever and so smart. But
it's like people who watch The Simpsons get all the references. Kathy, you get all the references.
which
Meanwhile,
oh
98%
yeah,
of
to
the
Poe.
watchers are like,
I,
oh, okay.
I remember watching that and just being like, and I love, I thought it was phenomenal. But we could probably talk about this subject for hours and hours and hours. But I felt like it was going to be a good one because there are lots of levels to it. There's the, like, holy crap, that's cool level to it, and then there's
Yeah.
the this is just a layer of the onion. This is
Yeah.
just us pulling back and seeing a little bit more about ourselves in it. So I enjoyed having this conversation with you.
I enjoyed having this conversation with you, Kathy.
I have to steel myself for a night in a lunatic asylum. So I'm
Of
probably
course
going to
you
nap
do.
before,
Of course you do.
if, I do have to say, if something interesting does come up, I am going to call you. I
Please
am going to
do.
bring you into it. I'm going to bring you into it. Um,
Virtually. So, in an upcoming episode, we'll hear more about your overnight expedition investigation at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I didn't make up the name, that's what it is in
all
West
right.
Virginia. And it's not a PC name. Just
Well,
kind
we'll
of,
talk about that too. You know,
we'll talk
when we
about
do,
that.
when I pull, you know, when we get this together and we get to the other side of it, because I have investigated this place before, and so I kind of have an idea of where I'm going to be spending my time. But we're
Awesome.
going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about just the fact of what I'm doing here, how it actually impacts the paranormal activity of a massive location like this.
Absolutely. So everybody should stay tuned for next
Yes,
time. We're going to hear
absolutely.
the incredible recap. I'm glad that I will be hearing it through
Remotely.
my computer or secondhand. So this has been an episode of Curious Explorers with my fabulous co-host Kathy Kelly, proprietress and founder of the Paranormal Museum in Asbury Park. I'm Tracy Stein. As always, so great to be with you, and we'll see you next time.
Happy exploring.
Happy exploring. Stay tuned for next week's episode of Curious Explorers, where we not only dive a little deeper into precognition and whether you can accurately predict the future, but we talk about retrocausation, otherwise known as retrocausality. Can you do something in the future to change the past or affect it in some way? You might be surprised, but there's some evidence to suggest that maybe we can. And if you enjoyed this episode or any other, please remember to like, share, follow, leave us a comment. It helps us continue bringing more spooky and intriguing content to you. Follow us on all your favorite social media apps at Curious Explorers Show. And give a shout out to Kathy and to me, Tracy. We love to hear from you. Until next time, see you then.